Hey, you're tuning in to It's a Matter of Speaking, a podcast for leading voices in the industries of health, wealth, and relationships. I'm your host, Dylan Barr. You know, when you have a piece of clothing that your wife or husband wants to throw away because it's got holes in it, and you just refuse, it ties to you. That's me with this sweatshirt, in case you were wondering. Whether you were wondering or not wondering, you should like and subscribe to this content if you enjoy it. You should make sure you comment at the end of this video, something that you're taking away. But today we talk to Bob Vetter. In the realm of health, Bob Vetter, MA, is a healer and soul coach who utilizes a combination of indigenous-inspired and Western methods to co-create lasting change for everyday modern problems. He's a cultural anthropologist. He's conducted field work on healing practices among Southern Plain tribes of Oklahoma. He was adopted by Oliver Pahdopony. I believe I'm saying that right. He's going to correct me today if I'm wrong. He's the last medicine man of the Comanche tribe. He authored the book Big Bow, The Spiritual Life and Teachings of the Kiowa Family. His later work took him to Mexico to learn the practice of traditional healing systems from ancient Mesoamerica. Today, Bob creatively combines indigenous-inspired methods of ceremony, altar work, connected to archetypal symbols, soul retrieval, and spiritual cleansing, along with modern techniques of neo-Ericksonian hypnosis and neurolinguistic programming. Bob teaches workshops on healing, and in his private one-on-one work, many of his clients are healers engaged in the deep work of connecting to their own wounded healer. There's a lot of excitement that I had for this interview and a lot of ignorance. I don't know a bunch about Western mythologies and religions. And Bob has been a participant in these tribes. He's not only studying data from outside, he's been adopted into these tribes, learned from these tribes for decades. I believe he started this in like 1986. We talk about a bunch of stuff today. We talk about the importance of having a passion, but also focusing on the people you're trying to help with that passion and being okay to adapt your passion. So it's not just you loving what you do, but you loving to do to help other people love what they do. We talked about the importance of looking at a crisis as really change, a shift and a time to heal. Talks about his story of how he got started. He's got like this, we call it a what the heck mindset. He's like, what the heck? Yeah, I like this. I'm going to try it. And getting outside his comfort zone that way. We talked about understanding the seed that you had at a young age before society took hold of you, and getting back to watering that seed and knowing that you might have to go through some wounds along the way, but to treat your own wounds before you help others. It's an amazing story he talks about with Oliver Pahdopony. I was enthralled with it. I just sat back and let him talk of this great true story that this man told him, not just myths of old. It was awesome. I really think you're going to like it. I hope you do. If you do, drop a like, drop a comment, subscribe to this. We love growing this with you. Also, in case you were wondering, this podcast, you know who it was brought to you by? It's brought to you by Speaker Mastermind. Over the last 8 years, this company has made it a mission to help its coaching and consulting clients get their authentic message out to the world in hopes of reaching their own desired audience through the power of speaking and business building. Over 650 clients landing TEDx talks, hundreds more speaking on virtual and physical stages around the world. Speaker Mastermind has perfected the art of delivering a top-tier message. They also offer programs to build and scale your own high-ticket offer, authentically market and sell it to your target audience so you can build a sustainably scaled business. So if you have a message in your mind, mastery in your mind or heart, you're looking to get it out to the world, there's links in the description below. Get to know us, jump on a call, totally free call. Maybe you're early in the process. Maybe you're ready to make a decision. But we could be a tribe that helps you out. And if not, that's totally okay too. Keep watching this content. We bring it to you for your enjoyment and hopefully help you get outside that comfort zone if that's where you're at. And if you're past it, you can relate with other people's stories. We hope you dig it. But let's just get to the talk. This way. I don't know. Our editor will figure it out. Here's me and Bob. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast, A Matter of Speaking, a podcast with leading voices. Episode 25. We're still here. Make sure you drop us a like, subscribe, comment at the end of this what you took away from Mr. Bob Vetter. Today, speaking with Bob Vetter in the realm of health, a healer and a soul coach. Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dylan. Pleasure to be here.
Very excited to chat with you about everything that you've learned with Western mythologies, Western spiritualities. I'm going to ask you a question on being a healer and a soul coach in just a second, but I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everybody when they come onto this podcast now, which is, you're a leading voice in what you do, right? As a healer and a soul coach. You've had an idea, and not only that, you've put yourself out there. Like you said, you've spoken on multiple podcasts. What does it mean to be a leading voice in your realm?
I think being a leading voice is focusing on the needs of the people who are listening. To be a leader is, in my understanding, not to put yourself ahead of everybody else, but to serve everybody else. And that, I think, is kind of a distinction that maybe not everybody makes in our society.
Yeah. Do you think it's find the people that need the help first? Or is it, for you, was it, hey, doing something you're very passionate about first and then finding the people that need what you have?
Well, that certainly is the order of how it happens.
Yeah.
You know, I think you have to have the passion to have a voice that people are going to listen to.
Mm-hmm.
But the message itself is all about how can the listener or the watcher, how can the other person transform themselves? Because if I just talk about myself, you know, it may be an interesting story, but if I can't break it down into something that makes a difference to you, then I've really fallen short. I had a friend who once put it to me this way when he wanted to work with me, and he asked the question, well, you know, before we start, do the things that you have to say, will they grow corn and potatoes? And I had to really think about that. You know, are the things that I'm teaching going to grow corn and potatoes for the person who's taking their time out to listen to me?
I really like that. And it's like, man, if it's only going to grow corn, I need to change some things up. Do you feel that after you find your passion, you have to be then a bit adaptable?
Without a doubt. Yeah. And, you know, in my case, as we're going to be getting into this and unpacking this, my field work, everything that I did was from other cultures. And then I had to say, well, you know, the people that I work with are not going to learn it in the same context that I did. So I have to be flexible enough to say, how does this work in our society?
I think that's so crucial. It's like you first find your passion, and then it's like the humility that can come from wanting to be adaptable to reach the right people you want to reach, right?
Exactly.
So
and caring about them, really loving them.
Yeah, along the way, because you want to help them grow corn and potatoes, right? And that's actually my first question. You're a healer and soul coach. Can you break that down a little bit? Like, who is it that you tend to work with, and what challenges are they coming to you with?
Yeah, so typically I have people who find themselves at a crossroads in their life for one reason or another. You know, when we talk about, I talk a lot about crisis. And a crisis can be a number of things, but it's generally a change. When if things are just going along the way that they always do, then you could just keep doing what you always did. But when we find ourselves at a crossroads where I have a choice to go down one road or another, all of a sudden everything is kind of thrown into question. Why are things the way they are? What should I do with my life? This is typically when I find people coming to me. I mean, very often they're trying to heal something in their life and trying to find new meaning and purpose out of that experience.
Do you have any examples of types of experiences people will come to you with?
Yeah, sure. So sometimes it's a health challenge. You know, I just worked with somebody this morning who she had an accident, and her foot, she doesn't know whether it's fractured or if it's sprained, but she lost her livelihood temporarily, and she finds herself confined to her home.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, everything that she used to do, she can't do. So we spent some time this morning reframing that experience and saying, what is there about that that can be of value?
Hmm.
So in her case, she was never able to meditate. And all of a sudden, now she finds herself with this free time that she needs. She's a massage therapist. So we talked about how could this experience change the way that you do massage with people who are immobilized? How can you take the lessons that you are learning right now from spending the last 2 weeks at home? How can you apply that to the people who are your clients? I mean, that's
Hmm.
just an example from today.
Yeah. I love that too, because when I first hear the word crisis, I'm like, does someone have to go through something huge? But the way that you break it down is a crisis is just when something happens in your life and something needs to change. And
Absolutely.
you talk about this shift, right? If we can start looking at this as like a time to shift and time to heal, then it kind of opens our eyes up to what can we learn from it rather than the woe is me.
Exactly. Moving from a victim mentality to one of how do I how do I move from this? How do I learn from this? And how does it give me something to give back to others, to the wider community?
Hmm. I'm very excited to ask you like how what you do to shift that, right? But I'm going to leave that for later because
Okay.
I wanted to understand who it is that you work with, right? Anyone out there that's going through their own crisis in their life. This is what Bob Better does, and it like crisis just means change. But I'm now curious of your story because this started really getting into cultural anthropology. So can you walk us through the beginning part of the story? What happened for you to get into cultural anthropology? And can you explain cultural anthropology for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, sure. So anthropology in general is the study of human beings. So it's the
Mhm.
widest discipline that you can imagine, and anything you want to know about human beings would fall into that discipline in one way or another. One of the subdisciplines of anthropology is cultural anthropology. So cultural anthropology is learning from other cultures, and there are two distinct methods within cultural anthropology: ethnography and ethnology. Ethnography is where I go in and I learn in depth about a particular culture by doing something called participant observation, where I am a participant. I'm doing what the people in that community do, but I also take a step back and kind of try to look at it as an observer objectively. So, ethnography is learning in depth about one culture through personal experience. Ethnology is the other tool, and that's where we take data, whether it's data that I found myself from my field work or use other people's field work, and take a question, a research question, and say, what do we find when we look at that question cross culturally with
Hmm.
cultures from all over the world? And both of those together give us a composite way of understanding other cultures and a lot of the questions, a lot of the inquiries that we make about what it is to be a human being.
I have a close friend who does a lot of work herself, and she talks about the difference between the map and the territory. Right, when the map we can see it from a 50,000 foot view, but there's a difference between being in the territory and actually being like, this is what it's like to live here. Seems very similar with these two. One of them is we're looking at data outside from everything that we see, but the other one, like you said, is your participant
Right.
observation.
You're
Okay.
on the ground.
Exactly. You're in the territory. So what personal experiences inspired you to get into this?
Yeah. So as a kid, I mean, I always felt like there was something wrong about my own society. Um, I have always felt that my culture, there are things that are great about the culture that I grew up in, but there are things that are lacking. I never felt that religion, Western religion, answered my spiritual questions, the quest that I was on. And I said, you know what? Maybe other cultures have a better way. So I began with an interest in Asian cultures, interestingly enough. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. I went to India when I was in still an undergraduate, And then I went on to graduate school. And graduate school is where things really shifted. And it was kind of my fate rather than a plan. So I had a dual major in philosophy and anthropology. I was not accepted into the program that I thought I would for grad school, and I was going to take a year off. And at the last minute, my advisor from the philosophy department said that he had a friend who was a professor at the University of Oklahoma in the philosophy department who was looking for a promising young graduate student. So I got in at the last minute with a full assistantship, and I was studying philosophy, but I hated the courses, and I was ready to get in my car and drive back to New York from Oklahoma. At the last minute, I was clearing my stuff out of the philosophy department, and I headed down. The anthropology department was in the same building a couple of floors down. So I just stopped, I just got off the elevator, walked in, and asked if I could talk to the department chairman. So he sat down with me, and I told him about my interest in anthropology, and he and I kind of hit it off. And he said, well, we could offer you the same assistantship, but there are two caveats. Number one, you'll have to teach introduction to anthropology. And, that was pretty daunting, but I said, okay. And then what's the other problem? And he said, well, it's too late in the semester for you to enroll in courses, but there's a catch 22 here, which is that you have to be a full-time student in order to have the assistantship. And I said, well, what can we do? And he said, well, you could enroll in a full-time course load of independent study. And I figured, well, since I find myself in Oklahoma, which is the home of more tribes of Native Americans than any other state in the country,
Mm.
I'll look at my area of interest, which is the intersection of healing and spirituality. And I said, well, I'd like to meet a medicine man. And that was the beginning. This was going to be just a short-term, one-semester project that all of a sudden changed the entire direction of my life up until today.
Yeah, because we've talked about you doing field work in Oklahoma, and I want to talk about someone that you met in just a second here. But on the podcast, I really love talking about the moments of our life where we decide to lean in and get uncomfortable. And you were saying it's like you're getting ready to leave this school, and you decide to take a turn, go down this hallway for anthropology and talk to someone, and then say yes to a daunting task of early college students. Good luck.
Yeah.
Like, do you recall what you felt or what internal dialogue you were going through for either of those to say yes to walk down the anthropology hall or to say yes to, like, why'd you do it?
Well, why I did it was just like, what the heck?
Yeah.
That I don't really have a better answer than that, other than to say, I've got nothing to lose. I might as well go in and talk to them.
Mm.
Now, what I didn't know at the time was that somebody had literally walked out the day before from teaching introduction to anthropology. Nobody told me that, but that event happening in the background was the impetus to all of this dropping in my lap. So now I said, he offers it to me, and I say, well, of course I'll teach introduction to anthropology. And then I'm walking away and I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to teach introduction to anthropology? I'm going from being an undergraduate student to teaching undergraduate students, and I don't know anything about teaching.
How did you work through that, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I don't mind you asking. It was every week I just thought to myself, well, I got to be a step ahead of them.
Mm.
And it was just one bite at a time.
I think that's it's you simplify it so well, where I think a lot of people can stay stuck in this, like, I don't know if I should do this. You say
Yeah.
it's a what the heck. And that what the
Yeah,
heck.
when you say making it simple, and that really is the point. If I had to tell you anything about my superpower,
Yeah.
we've all got a superpower.
Yeah.
And my superpower, I think, is connected with being a little simple-minded.
I love that.
And by that, what I didn't say was what I didn't like about the anthropology department was the fact that the professors that I had there took a complicated subject and they made it complicated. And if you really want to impress me, take a complicated subject and make it so simple that a child can understand it.
Mm.
That's what impresses me, and that's what I try to do. I try to break something down into bite-sized pieces, so something complex now is simple.
I had a still have a really good friend. She just graduated Stanford. I met her when I was living in Kenya, and she was an engineer for socially minded businesses. And she's like, "Well, I'll create spreadsheets, but then I typically deliver this information to our field team, like national Kenyans." And watching her work, I gave her that compliment. She said it still sticks with her as you do such a good job taking complex ideas and simplifying it for the layman, which is what we need. So it sounds like it's a gift that you have as well, and I think it's a gift that doesn't require an ego. You're like, because you really want to transmit this to other people rather than look how much information I know.
Well, it's my passion.
Yeah.
My passion is
And
the love for other people and the compassion of wanting to help out suffering.
honest question here, because this is the other one. I wasn't going to ask it, but you just said it again. It came up, and you said you've had the itch since being a young kid. Um, of understanding spirituality, understanding different ways of life, because you didn't get it in our typical Western religions of Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Do you feel if people are being honest with themselves, their true passion is always seated at a young age, or do you think it hits everybody differently?
I think that there is a seed of it in childhood.
Yeah.
A lot of times you don't understand it until later in life. But, even when I work with people, one of the questions that I often ask is, what did you love to do when you were a child? And that is how we often unlock their superpower,
Mm.
because everybody's given a gift, or a series of gifts. And we spend our lifetime trying to understand what that is. And sometimes the help of an outsider kind of shines a light on that.
Wow. What a great segue, because I do want to talk about an outsider that you met in your journey, right? And it's right where we just left off, which is, hey, I'm going to do field work here. You met a man, please correct me if I'm saying it wrong. Oliver Pahdopony.
Correct.
Could you tell us a little about him? He has this miraculous healing journey and what you learned from him, what he taught you.
Yeah, so, there's a whole longer story about how I met him, that which is fascinating in itself, but I'm gonna skip that for the sake of time and go right to when I met him.
Okay.
So I met him. I went to his home by myself, and I told him that I wanted to interview him. Would that be okay? And he said yes, and he told me to come back the following week. In the meantime, I met with my advisor. I told him that I had met this medicine man, and I wanted to learn all about Comanche medicine. What do I do? He said, well, that's a taboo subject. So when you go in, just have a list of questions, but avoid the topic of medicine. And I said, well, that's what I want to talk about. What am I going to talk about instead? And he said, well, do some research on traditional stories that the Comanches tell. So I did a whole research project on that over the course of the week, went with a legal pad full of questions that I was going to ask. And he heard me say that. And then he said, you know, my wife's sister talks to somebody about from the university about questions like that. But to tell you the truth, in my opinion, those are a bunch of fairy stories. But if you want to know some real stories about things that I know from my life, then I'll tell you. And I said, okay. And he said, maybe I'll tell you about how I came to be a medicine man. And he said, I didn't start out wanting to be a medicine man, but I got sick. And I went into the hospital in Lawton, and the doctors, they said, we doctors had a series of meetings over your case, and we've decided that what you have is inoperable cancer. And we've done everything for you that we can. You can either stay here and we could ease your pain, or you can go home to die, basically. But that's all we can do. Well, his son and his daughter came in, and he said to them, well, the doctors gave up on me. He said, what I'd like to do is to have you, talking to his son, leave me out there in the hills the way that our old folks used to do that. We don't know what's there, but maybe there's some power there that can help me. Well, his wife spoke up and she said, you're not man enough to take it. They're going to run you off. Those were her words. And what that means is he was talking about something called a vision quest, which is a solo vigil in a place of known power. I mean, he might not have put it that way, but that's really what we're talking about. And the Comanches say that there are spirits that inhabit places like the one that he went to. And before they're going to give you a gift of whatever it is, they're first going to challenge you. And they're purposely going to make it difficult for you. So when she said, you're not man enough to take it, they're going to run you off, meaning if you leave that spot out of fear, then whatever was your intention, whatever words you spoke about what you wanted, you're never going to get it. He said, well, the doctors gave up on me and I have nothing else to lose, so I might as well go. So the next time that there was a new moon, his son took him out there to the edge of the Wichita Mountains in southwest Oklahoma, to this place that he knew of. And he said, I went there with nothing but an eagle feather to hold on to for strength. I had a sheet to cover myself up. I had 4 corn shucks and some tobacco and matches, and that was it. And he said, I went there and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. Now, what he did with the corn shucks is he rolled 4 what are called prayer smokes. So they're cigarettes rolled in corn husk.
Hmm.
And I asked him, well, what happened? And he said, well, nothing happened for quite a while. I said, well, did you sleep that night? He said, no, I couldn't sleep. I was too scared. But he said, toward morning, there was a rustling of leaves over toward the mountain called Mount Scott. And he said, when I looked up, I could see a flame. And it was way, way off in the distance. And it would the flame would go on and then it would go off. And the flame would go on and then it would go off. And as it got closer towards me, I could make out what looked like a human form. And he referred to this as the visitor. And he said, then I realized that every time the visitor breathed out, every time he exhaled, fire shot out of its mouth. And he said, as that visitor started to approach me, he said, I got more and more scared. And I was a pathetic man. He said, I was like, if you take a fish and you pull it out on dry land, the fish flops around helpless. He said, I was that way.
Mm.
And then finally, he said, the visitor got right up in front of me and shot me with the fire. And he said, that was it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart stopped. Everything stopped for a while until finally the visitor spoke to me in my Comanche language. And the visitor asked me, he said, what are you doing here, son? And my grandpa chief, he said, well, I'm sick. And the visitor said, there's nothing the matter with you. You're going to be fine. But they sent me to take care of a man that's real bad off. And with that, the visitor started to take off. But then he turned around one more time and he looked at Grandpa Chief and he said, son, he said, did you know that this whole world that we live in, this entire world, stops for just a very little while at that moment right before morning? And that's when the time like me can enter into this world. And then the visitor took off to the west, the direction where things go to die. And he said, that was the last time I ever saw that visitor. Well, now let's fast forward in the story a little bit. His son came to pick him up, and his son ran to him, and he said, Dad, he said, how did you make it through the night last night? It was so cold. And Grandpa Chief said, well, where I was at, it was like springtime all night. And when they got down off that little rise where he had been, everywhere else there was a hard frost on the ground, but not in the spot where he was. Now, Grandpa Chief never went back to the doctors, never went back to the hospital, and never had that cancer again. One day, he was walking down the street in this little town that he lived at the outskirts of called Apache, Oklahoma. And he said there was an old lady there who was a medicine woman. And she looked at him and she came up to him and she said, what happened to you? And he didn't want to talk about it. So he said, nothing. And she said, no, I can tell from looking at you, something is different. What happened to you? And he still didn't want to talk about it. And she said, come on now. I know something happened. And finally, he told her the story that I just told you. And when she heard that story, she said to him, you know, you're good for something. You may not know what it is right now, but sometime soon you're going to find out what that is. Now, people around there started to hear this story about what had happened to him. And in their understanding, the type of experience that he had now gave him the power to help other people, to become a medicine man, to doctor other people who were sick. And I asked him, well, you know, how did you figure out what to do? I mean, he didn't have a direct teacher. And he said he started to think back to some of the things that he remembered as a boy. Now, we don't even know exactly what year he was born in. I met him in 1980, and he was born somewhere in the late 1890s in all likelihood. But he remembered when he was a boy watching the healers, the old timers that were old men when he was a little boy. And he remembered some of the things that he would see them do, how they doctored other people. So these are guys that were probably born in the early 1800s or maybe 1800. And then he said to me something very interesting. He said, what I found out is sickness is like a fire, and you've got to fight fire with fire. So he became a coal doctor. He would build a fire, he would pick up a hot coal, put it in his mouth, and he said that activated his healing power. So then he could put his hands on the patient and cure what that sickness was by that activated power. Now, that in itself is the formula for a wounded healer. And that is exactly the work that I engage in, is how my wounds led to me being a healer, how my grandpa Chief's wounds led to him being a healer, and how the people that I work with discover how in healing their wounds, they have the medicine to help other people. So there's a built-in formula here that we come to a crisis that needs resolution. I can either answer the call or I can allow myself to be a victim. If I answer the call and everything is right, there's some transformation that takes place in me that is my healing. And then it's my job to take something from that back into the community and share it with others so that my riches become a boon to everybody else.
There's so many times I wanted to come in and ask a question, but it was that's such a gripping story from the beginning too. Because what you just said there is like he had the intention of going out to cure himself, and it's the fear of like, yo, if you go out and run away, you're done. So for me, it's like it's the importance of the power of taking an intention, but then seeing it through. Because if we're not seeing it through, we're never going to experience what it is that we really want. So it shows the power. If you're going to set an intention for your life, you better be willing to see it through to the end.
Exactly.
Everything that he learned, it's the last things that we talk about, the last things that you just talked about there too, which is, hey, it's the wounded healer. You have to go into your own wounds. You have to heal yourself before you're ever going to be able to heal anybody else. We talk a lot in Speaker Mastermind that if you're going to make a change, it's the adage, if you're going to make a change, you need to change in yourself first. First focus on yourself. Would you say that's the biggest lesson then you took from your time with Oliver Pahdopony?
Well, you know, it's interesting that when I first heard the story, what I focused my attention on was the magic of it,
Hmm.
was this seeming superhuman ability
Yeah.
to be able to take in fire and use it as a doctoring principle of power. You know, that's the big flashy part of the story. But the meat of the story, the universal aspect of the story is, how do I heal? And how does that medicine become the medicine that I bring to the world? That's the story that it took me years and years to unpack that meaning.
Do you mind if I ask you? then what did you come across in your life that you realized I need to heal if I because now you're a healer and soul coach for others. What was it in yourself that you needed to work through to be able to do everything you do today?
Well, that's again, I was so self-unaware at the time that I
Sure.
had no idea, and it took years and years of me looking back on it to answer that question, but it started with him taking me as a grandson.
Hmm.
So I grew up in what I would describe as a broken family. And I don't mean to say that there was no love in my family, but my parents were divorced when I was a baby. And they gave me to my maternal grandparents to raise me. My maternal grandfather died when I was 7. So I grew up in a household. I was an only child. I grew up in a household where it was just me and my grandmother. And, she was working and she was absent a good part of the time. So I was alone in what I would describe as kind of a lonely childhood in that sense. And I find myself now, I'm a young adult, I'm in grad school. This old man adopts me as a grandson, takes me into his family. That was the first adoption. And over the course of the years, we could do 10 more podcasts about this, but I went into other tribes and other communities. Another old man took me as a son many, many years later. He was from the Caddo and Delaware tribes. And then another man, after he died, another man took me as a son. His name was Moses Starr. He was a Cheyenne elder. So I have Iowa relatives, Caddo relatives, Cheyenne relatives. And each time I was adopted into a family, I had not only that person as my relative, but their entire family. So now I go to this day, it's all these years later, but I still am active in all of those communities. I'm active in the ceremonies, I'm active to going to their homes. And, I have the same family responsibilities to them that I do to my own family. So it's a give and take.
Hmm.
But it changed my life because it healed that loneliness of that broken little child. So that was the first part of my healing, and then the other part really honestly had to do with the ceremonies that I came to be a part of. That I felt that through the sacrifices and the prayer and the spoken intentionality that we talked about before, all of those things somehow came together for me, and it wasn't until decades later that I could look back on that and understand that process.
It's so Steve Jobs said that one time in the commencement speeches, we can only connect the dots looking backwards, right? So it's like in hindsight's always going to be 2020, but once you're able to really heal this wound of yourself, of loneliness, of that true family, then you're able to go forth and help other people. And if you don't mind, because you're right, I could probably chat with you for 10 more episodes and maybe we'll have you back on the 35th episode and the 55th episode. But how do you now, with everything you've learned, all your times through all these people, were they all Comanche tribe?
No,
Okay, all different tribes.
yeah.
My apologies. With all
And
these
we
people,
didn't even get into the part of the story about Mexico. That's another part
yeah,
of the
we got okay. Come back from Mexico. Come back to hear Pahdopony's story of how he got all of that. How do you take everything that you've learned now, all these ancient practices, and incorporate it with and into the people that you help as a coach?
Yeah, so honestly, so I mentioned this parallel journey that I went on,
Hmm.
and it's a practice called Curanderismo, which is a healing practice from Mesoamerica, which includes Mexico. And I became an apprentice to a number of healers or curanderas, people who were practicing this form of medicine. And in it, I learned two things that are linked together that really are connected in Native American healing, but they were never put together for me in the same way. So these two things are called platica and limpia. So platica is a heart-to-heart talk, and we learn very, very specific techniques about bringing about your story, your own wounds, what it is that needs to be healed, articulating through this narrative medicine the emotions that have become problematic, that have become stuck. Whenever anybody talks about being stuck in a particular aspect of their life, there's something there that needs to be healed. Through Plática, we reveal the things that need to be changed. And then the second part is something called limpia, which is a spiritual cleansing ceremony. But in these ceremonies, we use something, not only narrative medicine, we're using symbolic healing. So practices that are designed to take the problem and then manipulate symbols as a way of changing it. So one of the things that we often use is an egg, and the egg is swept over the person's body as an energetic sponge. This is just one, the egg is only one of these, but I'm using it as an example because I just use the word symbolic healing. So in a symbolic way, you may not believe that you have energy that is stuck. But if you just think of it purely psychologically and emotionally, you can say, well, I have these emotions that are stuck. So I'm telling you that this egg has the power, the ability to absorb the energy that has been stuck for all this time. We also use something called a concept called susto. So susto in Spanish is fright. And we say that there are events in our lives that cause us susto, and along with it is soul loss. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Your entire soul is not lost, but when you undergo a trauma or an extremely difficult life situation, we're back to that concept of crisis. What happens is, if it's too overwhelming to you, that a splinter of your soul gets left behind at the time and the place of the incident. And it is a good short-term strategy because it means that you can compartmentalize the problem and then go on about your business of everyday life. So somebody coming back from war would be an extreme example of this with PTSD. The problem is that every susto that you experience in your life diminishes the vitality and the life force that you bring to bear in your everyday life. And very often one susto is linked to another one thematically. So when somebody says, boy, I can't understand why this keeps happening to me. Well, these cycles are connected with this vulnerability that you have because of that part of you that was left behind. So a part is left behind today, part is left behind tomorrow, day after that, and the next thing you know, you don't have that much left of your own vitality, and you wonder, why don't I have any energy? Why do I feel so overwhelmed by life? Why can't I do all the things that I set out to do? Well, it's because of these sustos, and we have methods of bringing and coaxing those parts of the soul back.
And if you don't mind me asking, you actually have a game, Sustos, on the website, which for anyone that isn't reading the bottom of the screen here, www.bobvetter.com. Someone goes to bobvetter.com, they get to play a free game. Can you tell us what you do with Sustos? I mean, because it seems like such a modern way to bring such a fun spiritual lesson into our lives. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so a susto is an opportunity. And again, just like I said before, you can be a victim or you can change something. And every susto is an opportunity to either go up or go down. And I'm thinking, how do I express that? And then I thought about the game that everybody played as a child, Chutes and Ladders. So I researched Chutes and Ladders, and what I found out was Chutes and Ladders didn't start out as a children's game. Interestingly enough, it started out as a game that Hindu monks would play with one another, and it was a way of exploring these states of consciousness. And at moments in the lives of the monks, they could either go up, spiritually ascend, or they could drop down and descend. And I said, well, there's a perfect analogy between that and Susto. So I constructed this game based on Chutes and Ladders and based on the 4 stages in a person's life and the types of challenges that we have. And I put it together as a game that I've played a bunch of times with different groups of people. And you play it with a die, you roll the die just like you're playing Chutes and Ladders, and you move the pieces to different spots where you have to answer questions about sustos and experiences in your life. So it's a great way to kind of play around with this concept and figure out what it means to your own life's journey.
Oh my, I will be checking that out. And we will be putting your website in the description below, so other people can check it out, because it's such a fun concept and you simplified in a point of a game. I'm sold. Bob, I could talk to you for a long time. I want to get to the last two questions. Typically it's three, but the first question is like, why did you decide to get outside your comfort zone? You've answered that. You've had this what the heck mindset when you have like these key moments in your life. And I think there's power that comes in that, right? It's like, because you remind yourself the seed from a young age. But if you don't mind me asking on the other side, and I always say this, let's take our ego hat off when you answer this. I'm not judging at all. There's a lot of people out there that never get outside their comfort zone, or they're about to. And like, what do you think it is that causes people to not get outside their comfort zone, to pursue something that is a passion for them since a young age?
Well, sometimes it's the seduction of thinking good enough is good enough. Sometimes it's like, well, I've got a comfortable life here, and I don't know, I never had to question much. So sometimes we ask the question, why is there suffering in the world? And whether it's good or bad, often it's suffering that leads us to question everything and to go outside of our comfort zone, where you get to the point where the situation itself is bad enough that I have to step out of my own comfort and question everything and really change the meanings that are associated with every part of my life. Now, as long as I'm comfortable in my home, I've got a big screen TV, I have all of my needs met, and I could just kind of go along, go to a bar. What I'm saying, that things are just kind of good enough. And I figured that's good enough for me. But often it's that stirring things up. You probably heard this analogy before, but it's, how does a pearl get formed? A pearl gets formed when a speck of sand goes into the shell, and the animal creates the pearl around it. So something beautiful comes out of something that's problematic.
And the thing I love about it, you're saying there too, is like, we just take comfort. It's like, we got to get to a point where we question everything. That doesn't mean you can't go back to comfort. Doesn't mean the rest of your life is like, oh my gosh, I may question everything, but at least gives you that chance to understand it. Now, last question for you, speaking to someone who is on the precipice of getting uncomfortable. They hear that from you. They're like, maybe I should question things. What would you tell them is the first step?
The first step is answering the call. Now, all of this can be compared to Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Because the hero is called to adventure. And you could say, well, you know what? I'm sorry, I'm busy. I'm not answering the call. But the minute I say yes to that is the moment that journey begins. And that's when things really take off.
Bob, thank you so much for today. I always tell myself, I'm like, I want to keep these at like 30 minutes. And the people that I get to speak with, I have the coolest job there is. I really, really appreciate it. If you're watching this or listening to this, make sure you drop a like and drop a comment for the biggest takeaway you took from today's podcast, or any big questions you might have for Bob. I'm sure he'd be happy to come back and answer some of them in the comments, or maybe we get you on again. Here's the biggest takeaways that I took. Typically, I have this long runway. I could talk about at the beginning where you say, hey, first thing you do is have a passion, but then focusing on the needs of the people first. We talked about that, how a crisis in our life is really just an opportunity for change, right? And shifting is a time to heal and to grow. But really the biggest thing that I took away for anyone listening or watching is, give yourself today a chance to go back to where you were as a child and understand where that seed was initially planted. What is it that you love to do? before society took a hold of you. And then know that we have to heal ourselves before we can really water that thoroughly to help other people in the process. And don't be afraid to answer the call. And maybe the call is this podcast. I appreciate you so much, Bob. Thank you so much for being on today's podcast.
Dylan, it's so great to be here. And you know what? You did a great job of what I described earlier, which is taking a bunch of stuff and making it simple.
Oh, man, I appreciate that. I'm next. I'm going to come learn from you. And if you're listening or watching this, I got a phone call. I think it's for you. We'll see you next week.